Hi students, this is Mrs. Foy and I am going to talk a little bit about Darwin and his theory of natural selection and theory of evolution. Um, so uh, I'm going to go kind of quickly through a lot of this because I know that we've already talked about it before or you've read about a little bit of it before, but just to kind of give you a flavor, we'll go just through this a little bit. So Darwin published his book on the origin of species in 1859. Of course, he had sat on that theory for many years. And actually, Darwin never used the word evolution. What the phrase that he used was descent with modification. So the descendants of organisms that have changed. This is a fabulous slide because it gives you a lot of the timeline about what was going on and when. And you can see that some of the big ideas in geology helped to frame Darwin's vision of the natural world and how long a period of time the earth had been changing. So you might want to take a look at some of these scientists and just have kind of a brief understanding of their contribution to the theory of evolution. So before Darwin, we had the Greek philosopher Aristotle and also the Old Testament holding forth the idea that species were created by God and they were static and unchanging. A guy named Carolus Linnaeus actually classified these organisms. He's the father of taxonomy. He gave the idea that every organism should have a genus and species name. We call that binomial nomenclature, and also gave big classification groups for every living thing on earth. So we had the biggest group was called the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, or kings play cards on fat green stools to help you remember the order there. Now we have domains. We have 3 domains, which are even bigger than kingdoms. The studies of fossils, of course, help to lay the groundwork for the theory of evolution, and scientists in Darwin's time were just beginning to understand that fossils were laid down in this law of strata, that the oldest fossils were at the bottom and that sediments would lay one on top of the other, and that the newer organisms, more recent organisms, would be on the top. So the study of fossils, paleontology, was largely developed by a guy named George Cuvier, and he advocated this idea of catastrophism, which means that every boundary in the strata represented some catastrophe, and we know that's not the case now, but that was an interesting theory. 2 other geologists that greatly influenced Darwin were Hutton and Lyell, and they put forth this idea that the earth has changed very slowly over time, and that those mechanisms of change are still happening today, and that is the principle of uniformitarianism. Excuse me. There was a scientist named Lamarck that was the first one to really talk about species changing over time, but his idea is that species evolved through the use and disuse of their body parts. So he would have said that giraffes have long necks because they stretch their necks to get leaves, and we know that is not supported by the evidence. So when Darwin began his odyssey in 1840, 1838 actually, the world was set pretty much on the verge of really enjoying science, but not really embracing it as far as it meaning that living things would have changed over time. So you know a little bit about Darwin. As a youngster, came from a very privileged family, tried medicine, didn't do well at that, tried theology, didn't do well at that, but took this unpaid position as a naturalist for a 5-year voyage on the Beagle. And he basically was a collector on the Beagle, and went all over the world collecting specimens and plants, mailing them back to England when he was able. and all the time was thinking about these organisms and how they could be different. Interesting down here as he went around the Cape Horn and was back over here in South America, right about over here, actually witnessed an earthquake, and witnessed the big shift in the mussel beds and how much higher they were after the earthquake than they were before, and that really greatly influenced his thinking, and he thought about the fossils he had seen on top of mountains and thought about how might those have happened there. And of course the famous Galapagos are just off the coast of Ecuador here, and we'll talk more about those. He did stop there. He was not very impressed with the Galapagos. They are actually new islands. They're the tops of volcanoes, fairly recent. And but he did recognize that the species there looked very similar to the ones he had seen on the mainland, but not exactly the same. So that kind of helped him get his wheels turning. But it was not until later, after he got back to England, that he took a look at some of the species that he had shipped back and began to really focus on the organisms on the Galapagos as being pivotal to his theory of evolution. So what Darwin believed is that these organisms had special adaptations to the environment, and he believed that that had a lot to do with the process of them becoming different species. So for example, the finches, these birds, kind of nondescript little, birds that were flying around and hopping on the ground when he was there, all descended from one ancestral finch that happened to come over on some type of raft, too far to fly for these birds. They're not seagoing birds, but probably came over on some kind of debris from some kind of storm or flood or earthquake, and began to populate the islands depending upon which food source they could capitalize on. And slowly over time we know that their beaks have evolved specifically for the food that was plentiful on that island. Darwin, of course, sat on his theory for almost 20 years until he was almost scooped by Alfred Russel Wallace, who had developed a similar theory, and then they quickly co-published, and he finished up his book on the origin of species. So the two main ideas on this book was that there was descent with modification, and that explains why we have all these different types of life, and that natural selection is the driving force behind, it's the engine of adaptive evolution, or evolution where you have organisms changing. Interesting, as I said, that he doesn't use the word evolution. In the first edition, he does actually use the word evolved, but does not use that. And in this book, interestingly, he does not talk about the evolution of humans. That was just kind of, he knew that people would make that jump, and that would be very controversial, and indeed it was. Although On the Origin of the Species was very popular. It was controversial, but it was very popular and sold out. I love this diagram. You can see this very clearly. He says, I think, and has this branching pattern of the tree of life. So today, we don't use necessarily a tree, but we use things called phylogenetic diagrams. We also use things called cladograms, and these show the kind of the family tree of, in this case, elephants and manatees and their distant relatives. So Darwin was very aware of this idea of artificial selection, and he knew that for millennia, humans had been purposefully breeding plants and animals to bring out the traits that were favorable for whatever we wanted for our purposes. But Darwin described basically 4 observations, and then from these he drew 2 inferences. And we talk a lot about animals, but we also should not forget plants. So all these different food crops, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, and I don't even know what this vegetable is, something I've never eaten. Anyway, these all come from the wild mustard plant, and they were bred by our early ancestors to develop these different foods. So one of the things that Darwin observed is that members of a population are going to vary. So here's a population of snails, and they can vary in their coloring of their shells. Traits are inherited from parent to offspring. Interesting about this that he and Gregor Mendel, were actually alive at the same time, but did not know about each other's research. If that had happened, that would have been amazing, because this really was, Darwin had no idea how these were inherited. They had put their two ideas together. That would have been amazing. And this idea that species were capable of producing much more offspring than an environment can hold. And so because of this lack of resources, or a limited amount, that many of the offspring do not survive. So this inference he made then from those observations is that the individuals that have better traits for that particular environment give them a higher probability of surviving. And so because individuals do not survive equally because they have different adaptations, that unequal reproduction will lead to the accumulation of these favorable traits in the population over time. And so that change in living things over time is what evolution is. We've already talked about the fact that Darwin was influenced by a guy named Thomas Malthus, who wrote a book about how human populations increase faster than the food supply and other resources, and so that was something that influenced his thinking. So this idea of natural selection, as we've talked about, is the driving force of evolution, and is the reason behind the rise of new species. So you have things as diverse as two different praying mantis, a stick mantis in Africa and a flowering mantis in Malaysia, and how different they can be just because of the different environments that they find themselves in. Very important to note that individuals do not evolve. So an individual is either going to survive or not survive, but it's the population that evolves over time. So we have lots of evidence for evolution. We have some direct observation of evolutionary change, of course, in organisms that reproduce very quickly, like microorganisms, and also the evolution of drug-resistant HIV. So we're going to talk just a little bit about Dr. John Endler's study of wild guppy populations. So these, I think, were in South America, but these guppies were in different pools. And one of the things that he knew from his studies, that brightly colored males were very attractive to females. So that was good to be brightly colored. However, brightly colored males made them more vulnerable to predation. So one of the things that he recognized is that guppy populations in pools with fewer predators had more brightly colored males. So what he did, being a scientist, is he took some brightly colored guppies from a pool with few predators and put them into a pool with lots of predators, and as he predicted, over time the population became more drab because there was evolutionary pressure with the predation. Then he took some more drab color guppies that came from a pool with lots of predators and put them in a pool that had few predators, and over time that population became more brightly colored. We also know that we have evidence of evolution because of the changes in HIV. So we know that HIV is a retrovirus. It uses the enzyme reverse transcriptase to take copies of its own RNA genome and make a DNA copy of that, and that gets inserted into the host cell's genome. And we have a drug called 3TC, which is designed to interfere with the manufacture of the DNA from the virus. And so we know that some individual HIV viruses have variations that allow them to produce DNA without errors, but we also know that there are populations of HIV viruses that have developed resistance to this drug, 3TC. And so we know that we can see this with viruses. We also can see this was an antiviral medication. We also see this with our antibiotics. So it's important to remember that natural selection doesn't create new traits. But natural selection is the mechanism by which new traits come about when there is a environmental condition that selects for them. So, other evidence that we have besides direct observation of evolution is the fossil record. So, we have a very, very rich fossil record, but fossils are rare. Fossils are actually more rare than certainly diamonds. Sorry, and so one of the criticisms of the fossil record is that we don't have intermediate forms. We have these missing links. Well, yeah, sure we do, because the chances of an organism, dying in a way and being covered in a way that would form a fossil, let alone being discovered, is very, very rare. So there are some organisms that we have a pretty clear picture of their evolution, whale evolution being one that we have filled out pretty recently. So we have a pretty clear picture of that. But for example, human evolution in the fossil record, we have some big gaps. Another evidence for evolution is homology. Homology means that there are resemblances that come from common ancestry. So a homologous structure is going to be two structures that are similar that come from a similar ancestor. So we would say the bones in the forelimbs of vertebrates are homologous. You can see the pattern of the bones here. So we have big arm bone, big arm bone, big arm bone, big arm bone in all these different creatures. We have two lower arm bones, our radius and ulna, a bunch of little carpals in our wrist, and then we have metacarpals and phalanges. And we can see the same pattern in these different vertebrates, and we would call these homologous structures. An analogous structure would be a similar structure that does not come from evolutionarily similar organisms. For example, a bat wing and a butterfly wing would be analogous, not homologous. We can also have comparative embryology that also gives us evidence that we come from common ancestors. So we have, for example, a chick embryo and a human embryo that look very similar. We both have postanal tails. We have pharyngeal gill slits. You see segmentation here called somites that are going to develop into muscles and bones. And so that is another evidence that we come from common ancestors. Vestigial structures are also evidence for evolution. They are remnants of features that were important in an organism's ancestors, but no longer are functional now, and kind of are still remnants, but are not really functioning. So, for example, nictitating membranes. We actually have a remnant of a nictitating membrane. You can see in the corner of your eye that little kind of pink structure is a leftover nictitating membrane from our reptile ancestors, and of course birds are reptile ancestors as well, and we can see that membrane there in that lovely bald eagle that we have just a remnant of. And you can see some of the other remnants, vestigial structures that we have in humans. The pelvic girdle in snakes is another famous one. We actually can see the remnants of a pelvic girdle, even though snakes have lost their hind limbs due to evolution. So we can think of evolutionary trees, and these really give us a great visual of the relatedness of these different organisms. And these branching points are going to show common ancestors. So we can see these vertebrates here, right? We can see these vertebrates. And we can see when these specific adaptations occurred in the evolution of vertebrates. So tetrapod limbs means four limbs. An amnion means the development of a fluid-filled membrane that surrounds a embryo and keeps it from drying out. And certain things like feathers, of course, that we know. There's some very interesting data actually about feathers in dinosaurs. But anyway, we can see a lot of relatedness by looking at these evolutionary trees. So convergent evolution is the evolution of organisms from different areas but with similar environments, and they kind of get to the same endpoint. So, for example, you have the sugar glider squirrel, and you have of Australia, and you have the flying squirrel of North America. They are not related, very, very, very distantly, but they have similar characteristics because they filled the same niche in two different environments, and they happen to evolve kind of co-evolution along similar tracks, but not from a common ancestor. Biogeography is this idea that geographic distribution and the geographic isolation can help to bring new species. And island biogeography is very interesting because island species very often came from nearby continents and then have evolved since they got to the island. So we see that on the Galapagos, we also see that on Hawaii. So this idea of continental drift, and the last time that the continents were all together, we called it Pangea. There were many times that the continents over the 4.6 billion years that the Earth has been around, there have been many times that the continents were one landmass and moved away. But the last time was 4.5, well, actually 650 million years ago, we had one big continent that began to break apart. And we have Antarctica and Australia that broke apart first. So we've talked about the difference between observation and inferences. This is more evidence of evolution, not with the resistance to DDT, and we also have evolution of malarial organisms to the medicines, the anti-malarial medications that we have. So hopefully this is giving you just a flavor of the theory of evolution, and we have lots more to learn.